Hello, this is Carolyn Woods from InEight. I'm part of the product marketing team, and I am here to introduce today Rick Dean, who will be presenting 7 surefire tricks for getting bids prepared with confidence. That is such a fancy title. I don't know how many of you have been listening in long enough, but the thing that we've been joking about is if any of you know Skip Farr, we've got Skip Tips, and now we're starting Rick's Tricks. So Rick is kicking us off with today's presentation. He is our EVP of Industry Engagement, being all formal and everything, which means that he leads our industry outreach efforts. He works with our most strategic clients, helping to develop them with work processes that improve their construction practices. Rick also happens to lead, for any of you also participating today, our industry advisory group, which focuses on our industry best practices and helps to validate our product portfolio. Rick has been a longtime employee of Hard Dollar and now InEight. He's been around since 1998, and he holds a distinction among very few in our company. He's actually one of our road warriors. Last year, he hit 35 countries, and he's been on every continent except Antarctica. So I think we need to fix that, Rick. So,
don't say that too loud.
I know one of you guys has to become our user in Antarctica. Nonetheless, we've got a good presentation for you. If you do have questions at any point for Rick, go ahead and type those into the questions window, and then we'll have some Q&A time at the end of the presentation. We'll go through those. So Rick, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Carolyn. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for tuning in to this webinar. I understand this series is really gaining a lot of traction out there in the market, and we're excited to be continuing on with that momentum. And I would like to thank Carolyn for that warm introduction, and it's clear to me that nobody in my family helped her prepare that. We are going to talk about preparing better and faster bids. I've come up with some ideas that hopefully will resonate with the audience. We've got 7 surefire tricks. And without further ado, we'll just list them all right here. Now, we are going to go through each of these individually, but just to get them all on the table, we're going to be talking about leveraging organizational best practices. We're going to talk about ensuring all estimators on the team consider the same variables, especially when we're looking at complex work and packages of work. Another thing that we're seeing a trend of in the industry is more and more customers really want to validate new estimates against historic data. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. For those of you who take quotes, either on subcontracted work activities or on materials and supplies, we're going to talk about automating some of the routine tasks associated with taking quotes and how to implement those quoted prices into your cost estimate and ultimately into your proposal. We're going to talk about something called distributing costs throughout the estimate and how to estimate something in one place but have it show up in numerous places. There's a variety of use cases surrounding that. We're going to talk about alternate scenarios, ways in which we can turn on and off sections of the bid based on various ways of performing the same task, or maybe based on owner requirements that might be shifting at the last minute. And then we're also going to talk about creating a resource-loaded schedule. And what that's going to allow us to do is to help us deliver not only a cost estimate, but a time-based and a resource-based look at the project over time. So those are our 7 items, and now what we're going to do is we'll explore each of these individually. We're going to focus on the how behind the what. So in terms of leveraging organizational best practices, one of the ways that our customers really, and people in the market in general, address this is through the use of templates and creating libraries of organizational data. And you might ask yourself, well, gosh, I've been with this company for 5 or 10 or 15 years, and we really don't have a common place where we keep this information. And that's quite prevalent in the industry. There's a lot of, well, every estimate we put together is a one-off. Everything is so unique, it doesn't really make sense to try to create a big pile of this organizational history. But I want to try to poke through that myth a little bit. When it all boils down, yes, every project is unique, and every owner and every individual estimate does have its uniqueness. But when you boil it down to its core components, guess what? We're dealing with labor, we're dealing with equipment, we're dealing with materials, we're dealing with productivity rates, we're dealing with quotes from third parties, and when we distill that down to its lowest common denominator, that's where we can really start to see and compare some of these consistencies and some of the more likenesses rather than uniquenesses between projects. So what we've seen is we've seen those companies that adopt digital transformation creating libraries containing commonly estimated items, and those would include not only the work items themselves and the costs, but the details behind those. So what are the resources that are driving those unit or those total costs? What are the activities that make up that chunk of work? What are the costs of those resources, and what sort of assumptions are we making about durations or productivity? We've seen organizations arrange this information by many different attributes, including the type of work. Maybe it's based on owner or client specification. Maybe it's based on geography. Maybe we're going to have a different approach to doing work in South America than we are in North America. Maybe we're going to have a different set of resources or a different set of costs available to us if we're doing work in Biloxi, Mississippi, rather than Midtown Manhattan in New York City. So those are the things that we can use to help segregate this library and make sure we're looking at the most appropriate information. And then ultimately, we want to really start a new estimate, not necessarily from scratch, putting things together for the first time, but we really want to start more in edit mode, and that would allow us then to adjust the estimate details as necessary to account for any unique project requirements or conditions that might be germane to this project that we didn't encounter on the last project. And, finally, I've always said that software is an enabling tool, and it works best when there are established business processes that the software can align to. And this would help to set up an expectation that estimators are incorporating organizational standards into their estimates. So there's a few different ways to do that. From this screenshot, we can see that, for instance, our tool allows new jobs to be created either from scratch, from a template. Maybe the job I'm looking at, the specs and the plans I've received are very similar to a job I just did 3 months ago. Maybe I want to just copy that entire project over. We have tools in our application that allow us to selectively pick and choose components from one source job or from multiple source jobs. Gee, the concrete in this project looks a lot like the concrete we did on job XYZ 6 months ago, but the piping sure looks like a lot alike the piping we just did on the project last month. So we can selectively bring in bits and pieces through tools like our bid wizard. I'm going to flip back to the application here real quick, and we'll take a look and see how some of these things might be managed inside of the tool. So for instance, if I were to open up InEight Estimate and I wanted to create a new job from a template, in my sample data here, maybe I've created templates that reflect the type of work I perform. Maybe I've got an infrastructure template or a power station template or a substation template, or maybe I do some work supporting the oil and gas industry and I've got a turnarounds template, or maybe a wastewater treatment template, etc. So these can be organized and tagged and labeled depending on the type of work your organization does, to really ensure that when you create a project from a template, all of that good stuff that should feed into that project, the activities, the resources, the productivity assumptions, will come lock, stock, and barrel. And then again, I can really use my time as an estimator to really begin from an edit mode perspective and developing all that from scratch. The next thing I want to talk about, and this dovetails very nicely into the last discussion on templates, is making sure that all estimators within an organization are considering the same variables when they're estimating complex work. And I mention all estimators because what we're seeing in the market right now, there's sort of a graying of the industry, and I feel confident saying that with a head full of gray hair. A lot of the more seasoned and experienced folks are looking at retirement dates and are looking at getting out of the industry if they haven't already. And frankly, there's just not enough new blood coming into the industry to replace this experience at a rate at which they're leaving or planning on leaving over the next 5 or 10 years. So that's a real concern to the industry and to individual organizations alike. And one of the things that, again, progressive organizations are doing is they're trying to capture that knowledge before it walks out the door. And there are lots of different ways of doing that. One of the ways I'm going to show you here is through the use of what we call cost item assemblies. And basically what these are pre-built questionnaires that guide estimators. They're based on some input parameters that in turn generate calculations, and then ultimately those calculation results will drive the creation, or at least the beginning of the creation of an estimate, resources, activities, quantities, productivity rates, and more. So I'd like to show how our tool supports this, give you an illustration of how InEight might handle this. I'm going to flip over to the application here and just show a quick example of this. So as an estimator, I'm in a part of the tool where I'm doing my estimating, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to insert what we call a cost item assembly as a subordinate line item. I've started in a blank estimate, but this could be added anywhere in an existing estimate. And then I'll be picking from a list of different assemblies that I've put together. And in this example, I'm going to use this warehouse wizard because I think it does a good job of illustrating the point we're trying to get across here. Excuse me. So as a user of the tool, I'm prompted to answer a few different questions about the parameters of this warehouse. Now, for reference, I could have pictures, I could have drawings, I could have specs indicating which elements we're taking off here. But this is pretty straightforward. I'm going to answer a question about the length of the warehouse, the width of the warehouse, how tall it is. We're going to answer some questions about column-based spacing, lengths and widths. We're going to talk about the type of exterior wall system that we might want to use, even down to how much square footage of office area we might be required to put in for this particular project, even down to the number of parking spaces. Now, you'll notice in this example, we had some default values pre-populated here. So users can start, again, with some preset values. If I need to change any of these, I certainly can. You'll notice some of these variables accept numeric inputs. Some of them are chosen from pick lists. So in this case, we're going to do some metal siding for our exterior walls. And all I'm going to do now is hit OK. And then the system is going to create for me a very detailed layout of an estimate that includes all of the necessary activities that would go into building such a warehouse. And each of these activities comes preloaded with resources and quantities whose values are driven by the results of those calculations. So at this point, I wouldn't necessarily print a proposal and turn it in, but a conversation that many of our customers have is they're talking to a long-time client, they're considering a project, they want to get a rough order of magnitude estimate together to understand what sort of budget they might need to build something. And within, literally a few minutes, I can give them a ballpark value of this while it's based on a good amount of detailed buildup. And then as the project gets steam and as more of the design becomes known, as more of those elements are sort of born out of the discussions I'm having with this customer, then we can start to fine-tune this and incorporate some of those new ideas. But a lot of the legwork in terms of putting an estimate together has already been done for me. So rather than doing this on each and every project that comes down the pike, maybe it makes sense to spend a little bit of time, build one of these models out initially, and then let it be leveraged by the entire group. So that's something that we call cost item assemblies, very powerful part of the application. The next thing I want to talk about is validating an estimate against historic data. And again, when I have discussions with people in the industry, I ask them about historic data, and there's usually some anecdotal reference to 3-ring binders that are up behind the shelf on the credenza behind their desk, or maybe it's anecdotal where I need to send an email to Bob or Jill or Sue, because I remember they did a similar piece of work, and I wanted to remember what sort of man hours or what sort of costs they ran into. And organizations struggle with this, frankly. And this is something where people say, gosh, if I had started estimating and calling an apple all along, I'd be in a place where I could really look back across my history. And one of the things I'm reminded of is a story I heard one Sunday morning sitting in the pew listening to the preacher talk. He said the best time to plant a shade tree is either 15 years ago or today. So we've got a lot of organizational history. We can spend a lot of time wringing our hands about, well, we can't really collect it, we can't really gather it, we can't organize it. Well, we might want to take a fresh look at that problem and maybe not focus so much on the stuff that's behind us, but focus on the stuff that's in front of us. Maybe there's a way, starting today, we can start labeling things and coding things and calling things a similar name where 18 months, 24 months from now, we'll have access to a library of historic information that we can use. So I want to hop back in the tool again, and I want to show an example of what benchmarking might look like. So in this case, I'm going to open up a project where I've maybe got some benchmarks. And as I'm putting this estimate together, you can see it's a pipeline project. Maybe it's got some multidiscipline work. It's got some pipeline, some civil. Maybe there's a mechanical element to this. As I sort of drill down into this, maybe there's a specific piece of this civil work. In fact, it's form work for some concrete we're going to put in. And maybe what I want to do is, as I'm looking at this particular crew and as I'm making assumptions about their productivity, which is driving unit and total costs, just with the click of a button, I can see what my historic data has been for performing this type of work. I can see how my current estimate, this white diamond that's in this red zone, we'll talk about that in a moment, compares to my average rate for doing this work. And then the scatter graph also shows me historic data points for previously estimated as well as previously built values. So by hovering my mouse over this scattergram, I can see the projects, I can see data related to those projects where I've done this similar type of work. I can see quantity growth or quantity shrinkage based on actual work being performed. And I've even set a range, hence the reference to the colors. I've set this up where if I'm between 0 and 6% variance from my average, I would like to see that represented in this green band. If I'm between 6 and 12% from the average, I'd like to see it presented in this yellow band. And if I'm greater than 12% from my average, I'd like to see those data points represented in this red band. So at a glance, I can tell if I'm going to go to review, and as an estimator, one of my key jobs is to defend my estimate and to stand up to a review amongst my peers and my management. Maybe I've got a really good reason why we're up here in this red zone and we're looking at 75 cents a unit when we've actually performed this work for 53 cents a unit in the past. But at least I'm armed with that data, and it's not a guessing game when I'm ready to go into that review and defend my estimate. Another way to use this information as well, so the use case I just talked about was internally defending the estimate against questions from my peers and my management. But maybe I'm having a meeting with a customer, and the customer is saying, gee, Rick, your numbers are just too high for performing this kind of work. I can actually pull out my historic data points for doing that kind of work and saying, well, Mr. Customer, I understand your concern, but history has shown us that if you think about this issue and if you include this part of scope into the work, I might not be the cheapest, but as you can see here, I've done this work, and I can tell you with confidence, based on history, where we're likely to land doing this work for you in the future. And sometimes customers appreciate that approach. They like that candor, and they like that frankness that, hey, I might not be the lowest bid out there, but I am considering these other things, and if someone else is giving you a lower bid, you might want to ask them if they've included X, Y, and Z, or for those of you north of the border, X, Y, and Z in their bid proposals. And then the third bullet point on this list is to use that historic data as a qualifying metric. when performing negotiated work. So again, a lot of times our customers are telling us, even with the hot market that we're seeing today, that there might be not only a commercial proposal for doing the work, but a technical proposal. Have you folks done this type of work in the past? Are you qualified to even bid on this project? And by coming to the table with a library of historic data points, sometimes that really speaks to a lot of credibility and helps to gain confidence as well from a qualifying perspective. So I sort of alluded to this on the last piece, which was to consider X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z. When thinking about a pricing proposal or at least a cost estimate, I wanted to talk about some of the things that our customers deal with when they're taking quotes from either subcontractors or material vendors. From a software vendor's perspective, it's easy to think about all the great bells and whistles in your software. Anecdotally, I remember years ago we had a customer that was consistently buying a new seat of our software as he hired new people. His business was experiencing some growth. He wanted to staff up his estimating team, and he would call us on a fairly frequent basis and say, hey, I just hired another estimator. I'd like to buy another license of your software. Certainly a delightful call to get on the receiving end. And one day I asked him, I said, you've been adding on to the software, and it sounds like your business is growing, you're hiring people. What is it about our software that you really like? And I was expecting him to say, well, the last minute bid closeout, or, the ability to leverage data, or to have a library of my historic data. What he told me was, I just like the fact that everyone has access to the same address book of suppliers and subcontractors. Back in the day, Joe would have a Rolodex on his desk with his preferred suppliers. Sue would have a Rolodex on her desk with her preferred providers, but Joe would never call Sue's providers, and Sue would never call Joe's providers. By having your system, everyone is linked into the same shared database of subcontractors and vendors. And again, from a vendor's perspective, you'd think, well, gosh, even in this day and age, you can go out and get an app that has contact information in it, and that's not such a big deal. But for that customer and for that organization, it was huge. He wanted everyone to be able to leverage everyone else's efficiencies and relationships as it related to going to market to get quotes. So that was something that really caught my attention as well. That can be a very valuable capability. And not only are we sharing their phone numbers and their email addresses and their physical addresses, but we can also load in key default information about what these folks do. Is this a signage subcontractor? Is this someone that typically helps me out with rebar installation? Is this someone that can help me out with installing silt fences, et cetera? So having that sort of default information relative to those subs and vendors can be very helpful as well. As I go out and talk to people in the industry, I ask them in many cases how they communicate their needs or their scope to their subs and their vendors when they're putting an estimate together. And sometimes, on the one end of the scale, we have people say, well, we typically bid on large publicly advertised projects, and so as a result, we get a lot of unsolicited quotes coming in the door, and that's not really something that we have to go out and do. And that's really on one side of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum, well, we have this process where we type a lot of information into a letter format, and then we send it out, and we got a few different people involved in that process. Most folks are kind of somewhere in the middle, but we might want to consider, again, under the subject of automating routine tasks, maybe there is a way to automate the generation of those RFQs so we can easily get the same information to multiple suppliers and really help ourselves by doing that apples-to-apples comparison. As I mentioned earlier, each vendor, each subcontractor may have a different specialty that we want to leverage, and maybe we want to organize the stuff that they're going to be quoting us by functional group. So we call those quote groups. In our software, we're going to see, as you might have expected, we're going to see a brief demonstration of that here in a moment. And then we want to be able to capture key criteria to do those true apples-to-apples comparisons. And if I'm really looking at a fruit basket where someone's bid apples and someone's bid pears and someone's bid oranges, I want to be able to somehow make an apples-to-apples comparison out of that information. And then finally, for those of our customers that work on public projects, sometimes we see this at the municipal level all the way up to the federal level, tracking those NDE, WBE, DBE requirements where maybe a certain percentage of the value of the project needs to be awarded to those folks that identify themselves as minority-owned business enterprises or women-owned business enterprises or disadvantaged business enterprises. And we'll show you some tools to be able to track those objectives as well. So again, we'll jump into the live tool here and take a look at what that might look like in the application. So in this particular instance, I'm looking at an estimate I've put together that's got some pipe work and some civil work. And maybe what I'm interested in doing here is categorizing my work through the use of this quote group. So maybe I'm interested in looking at that work that is related to signage. So whether there's one item or 100 items in my estimate, I can easily filter to them. You can kind of get the idea here, those of you who have used Excel and things like that. You can maybe want to apply multiple filters and be able to easily identify those elements of work that have been labeled a certain way. And then sort of taking this to the next step, if I wanted to generate an RFQ or request for quote, you'll notice in our quote module here, we have different options that we can look at. Maybe one of those is to create a request for quote. Here's an item here for rebar installation. And if I wanted to simply generate a document that would consider all of these elements, very easy to generate that. All I would need to do is press a couple of buttons, and you can see it's generating the document in question. And good old Microsoft Word pops up, and it's got pertinent information about who I want to send the RFQ to, who it's coming from, key information about the project. I sort of cut some corners there. I could have put some information in there about response instructions. I could have listed some special terms and conditions. I could have put in some special notes. And then the next page is addressed back to me. This is the page that they would sign and send back along with their pricing. So as I go around and meet with people and talk about different parts of their business processes, there seems to be some consensus that this is just by nature a messy process. But again, there are some tools out there that can help automate some of this and at least take it off the estimator's plate. And then as it relates to doing some on-screen comparisons, perhaps I want to come in here and I want to look at my work and I want to look at it relative to the pricing I'm receiving to different customers. So this is what we call our quote, compare, and award form. And here I can compare maybe a plug or a placeholder value that I had in the estimate before I went out to market to try to get some pricing for this. I can also compare, and I think this is an important consideration, what it would cost me to do that work myself if I had detailed the activity by using my own crews and my own resources, productivity, et cetera. So in this case, I didn't detail that out. Maybe I just don't have the competency or the interest to get into this particular type of work, so I'm going to rely completely on subcontractors. And then I can see I've got some quotes here coming from creatively named subcontractor number 4 and subcontractor number 3, and I can see what we call their comparable values are. Now, this is the part I was talking about earlier where I said I want to make a true apples to apples comparison, because I know, based on having done this type of work in the past, that there might be, instead of just going out there and installing the signs, maybe there's an additional mobilization cost due to the phasing of the project, and I want to include that in their estimate. I don't want to be surprised by a change order later. Maybe there's a survey or a layout that needs to take place in order to perform this work. Maybe there's temporary traffic control devices that need to be installed, or maybe we need to do a lane blockage for an overhead sign installation that includes the use of a flagman. So each of these can have a monetary amount associated with them. And if those things are not included in their estimate, I want to bump up their estimate by that monetary difference so that I've got an all-in cost. So you can see here in example sub 4's case, example sub 4 quoted me $13,000 to do this work, but did not consider additional mobilization costs due to phasing. So I wanted to throw in another $1,800 to make their price a little bit more realistic. And then I would look over here at example sub 3. Their initial quoted price was $11,000, $2,000 cheaper than their competitor over here, but they left a couple things out. They didn't anticipate having to do their own survey or having to provide a flagman. So I've sort of adjusted their estimate to include those things, and I can see that just priced them out of the market. They're $200 higher than their neighbor here to the left. This little M signifies that this subcontractor has some minority status, and you can even see worked into their naming convention is the fact they're a DBE. So if this were a publicly funded project where MBE, DBE requirements were important, I might want to take that information into consideration. There's my visual clue right here as I'm about to award this work, how I want to be able to do that. So very easy in our tool to click a button, award all. Haven't really sent out a contract, haven't really contractually obligated to this contractor. What I've really done is I've shifted the amount of money I'm using in the estimate to cover this estimate, this bid, as well as any other condition that might apply. So these scope items can be really, really helpful when we're making sure we want to do an apples to apples comparison. And then ultimately within the same set of tools, there's a screen I can go to that's going to track how I'm performing relative to my minority goals or those MBE, DBE objectives that I've set up. So here I can see that my goal was to have a 5% DBE share associated with the project, and right now I'm running at about 1.14%. So this variance column is telling me I need to find out a way to either provide really, really good documentation as to why I couldn't use any DBEs, or find a DBE provider that can help me out with $202,000 of value in the estimate. Now in the MBE world, I didn't have any goal there, but I can see I'm tracking very well. I do have an MBE that's agreed to perform $1.5 million worth of work, helping me satisfy 28.57% of the contract amount. So some good indices, some good KPIs right at my fingertips by using the tool, as opposed to tracking this in a third spreadsheet that's on someone's hard drive on their computer that is not really integrated in with the cost estimate. Again, a lot of this boils down to documentation, and 18 months from now, if there is an issue, if there is a claim, I've got all that information stored neatly in one place that I can refer to get those answers if I start getting asked a bunch of questions. So for those of you playing along at home, we've completed 4 of our 7 topics, which tells us some rough math, and I didn't even have to use InEight estimate to figure this out. We've got 3 left. So the next one I want to talk about is item number 5, distributing our costs throughout the estimate. And this comes up in a lot of discussions I have with customers, in that it's typically some sort of indirect or overhead cost that they want to be able to estimate and update in one place, and that updating is key. I'll give you an example. So the client has asked for pricing on 20 or 30 or 200 or 300 individual bid items or pay items, but I've got a lot of overhead on this project that is really going to be estimated in one place, and it's not really dependent on any specific item. It really isn't that dependent on installing the underground pipe, or it's not that dependent on pouring the concrete or erecting the structure. These are just costs that I'm going to have to incur at the project level. They can include a job site trailer, they can include my indirect staff, they can include security services and fencing, and maybe the rent next door for a materials staging area. So all of these things are going to cost me as a contractor money, but I need a way to show my owner how each of those items that he or she is asking me to provide a price for, how each of those carries a share of those indirect costs. So this is what we call in our tool cost allocations, and I wanted to show an example of that as well. So I'll head back into my project file here, and I'll go into a part of the tool where we do our estimating, and you can see there's a line item here for job overhead, indirect costs. And again, some of those things I mentioned earlier, setting up the job site itself, providing rent for the job site trailer. Maybe I need some utilities brought into the job site during construction, and maybe I've got a supervisory staff whose costs I want to distribute back as well. So with these types of items, one of the things we allow our customers to do is to use this allocation feature. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to really, as its name suggests, allocate or distribute these costs back to the estimate. And once I choose that I want to allocate this item's costs, you'll notice that some other options are available to me. So how do I want to do this? Do I want to do this maybe by quantity? Do I want to do it by percentage? Do I want to take 30% of the cost and put it here, 10% of the cost and put it here? But the tool will also allow me to do things like push it back proportionately based on some attribute of the work, like man hours, or by my total labor costs, or by my total subcontract costs, or maybe by my total cost independent of category, or maybe based on the duration of the activities. So a lot of flexibility has been built in here, and if I decided I wanted to spread it back to various items based on my labor total cost, then the next set of decisions that I'd make is, well, to which items do I want to push that cost back to? So I can sit here and choose which items are going to receive a proportionate share of these costs, and then the tool will sort of keep track for me of how much of it has been fully allocated. And in this case, because it's doing it proportionally, I don't have to think about any bits that I missed, and I can come in here and hit OK. And now this job overhead, you'll see it's grayed out down here. We don't want to double count that $14,000 of cost, but what's happened is it's been distributed throughout the estimate. So each of those receiving items now picks up a share of those job overhead costs based on a quantity distribution. So 3% of it landed here, didn't get a lot of it here, etc. So this has now been distributed back throughout the estimate, and I can see that 97% of it was picked up by the excavation item. So what's kind of neat about that is in the 11th hour, the proverbial 11th hour, when someone is asking questions about those utilities that are now distributed throughout the estimate, well, you know, how much money did we have in there for utilities? Well, I had 4 months of rent for the office trailer. Well, you know, we all discussed this is going to be a 6-month project. I can go in one place and update that value, and I don't have to worry now about updating it in all of the places where that allocation has been distributed. It's been done for me. So if you think about some of your indirect costs, I wanted to add another person to my indirects, or maybe I feel that I've got too many clerks on my indirect staff and I want to knock that number down. I can go into one place very late in the game, make those adjustments, and then they'll reverberate throughout the estimate based on those parameters that I've chosen earlier. So again, a lot of our customers find that particular feature to be very, very helpful, especially when their bid items or their pay items are in phases. So my phase 1 indirects, I want to push back to only those items that are occurring in phase 1 of the project. My phase 2 indirects, where we really start staffing up and we're going to need a lot more supervision on site, I want to push those back to the main work activities that we're going to be performing during that part of the project. And then as we're ramping down, perhaps in phase 3 of the project, I can start to let some of my supervisory crew, some of my indirect folks pursue other opportunities within the organization, and maybe I want to distribute those indirect costs only to those items that are going to be happening in those later phases of the project. Alternate scenarios. This probably doesn't apply to anybody on this webinar, but some of our customers tell us they work with difficult clients that are always posing different scenarios to them. I say that tongue firmly planted in cheek because it's something that we just see a lot in the industry, where you know, the owners, rightly so, they want to get the most bang for their buck. So they're looking for combinations of items. I want a base bid from you, but give me an option on including alternate A, alternate B, alternate C, alternate A and C and B, and E without A through D. So instead of putting together 5 or 6 different estimates to cover each one of those scenarios, this tool will allow us to pretty easily take into consideration what those scenarios look like and to automate the process of sort of turning on and off different sections of the estimate. And again, for those contractors who are working for owners that are looking for the best combination of value and price, this can be a very valuable tool. You know, if I'm an owner and I'm using this tool, maybe I want to see if it makes sense to use some of my own maintenance resources for some of this plant work, or to bring in some third-party contractors to do the work. What would that look to my resource allocations and my resource requirements and staffing across the project, doing it myself versus having someone come in and do that? Maybe there's 2 different ways to skin the proverbial cat, and I want to estimate both of those, and then I want to be able to quickly turn on and off those different scenarios. So again, we'll take a look inside of the tool and see how we might be able to manage this. So as I'm putting a cost estimate together, I can account for several things. I'll go take a little journey into some setup. Where we're setting up some of the attributes in the project, I'm going to go into job properties, and you can see within the job properties section of the tool, there's a place where I can account for alternates. And what the alternates are going to let me do is to define what's included in this alternate. So here's an alternate called toll booth, and I've said I wanted this line item to be associated with turning this alternate on. You'll also notice that I can turn things off by choosing an alternate as well. So maybe we're considering building a building, and maybe we're considering a certain type of stud work, maybe wood studs versus metal studs, and I want to be able to estimate them both, understand what the costs are, what the labor and the material requirements are going to be under either approach, and then simply toggle back and forth between the 2 options. So where we do the actual toggling, Carolyn is looking that up, by the way, to see if that's an actual word in her dictionary, toggling.
Toggling.
But what we're going to do here is we're going to come into the section of the tool where it says alternate scenarios. And what we can do here is if we didn't want to include the toll booth in our estimate, I could simply uncheck it at this point, and then the system automatically pulls out those costs, those resource requirements, those materials, those man hours, those durations from the rest of the estimate. So in this case, I've turned off structure of work. If I wanted to turn it back on, if the client calls me back 10 minutes later and says, hey, Rick, I need you to include the cost of that toll booth in your pricing estimate, I don't have to recreate the wheel. I don't have to figure out what I did, what all went into that. I can just simply turn it on. And now all of these activities that are associated all the way down to the 70s style wood paneling, that's all now included back in my estimate for this particular customer. And then you'll also notice alternates can turn off sections of the estimate as well. So if I were going to do the 24-inch pipe, for instance, maybe that's going to result in the 36-inch pipe being pulled out of the estimate. So again, very easy to turn on and off sections of the estimate. It really only takes a couple of minutes to set these up ahead of time. But if you know going in that there's going to be some give and take and some value engineering being done on this project in terms of what's best to include, what's going to give the project owner the most bang for their buck, fairly easy to set these up and then just have the program come through and turn those items on and off based on how we really want to prepare this estimate. So in this case, I've just flipped both switches. I said, let's not include the toll booth, but let's include the pipe work that we had discussed. And now the estimate has been adjusted to account for that. So again, I'm not going through spreadsheets. I'm not making sure that the formulas leading to the summary pages on my spreadsheets are capturing or not capturing that range of data. Okay, we just took out rows 26 through 42 of the spreadsheet, does that sum if now include those rows? No, this tool has done it all for me automatically. Item 7. Carolyn, help me again, remember. How many Surefire tricks did we have in this?
7.
7, okay, so this would be
right
the
there.
last one. So it's a bittersweet moment for me because I know when we're done with this,
it's all over.
We're going to say goodbye to our audience. So this is all about creating an integrated schedule at the same time I'm putting a cost estimate together. So why do we want to create schedules in the first place? Well, as I talk to our customers, the number one reason I hear of scheduling requirements is because the owner wants a schedule. The owner demands a schedule. The owner wants a schedule in any format that I want to provide it as long as it's Primavera. I don't know if any of those resonate with you, but those are some things that I've heard. Also, again, more progressive organizations, even if a schedule is not required by the owner, maybe they see value in being able to look at a time-phased budget, a time-phased cost curve, a time-phased revenue curve, a time-phased allocation of their resources, just to meet their internal requirements. Maybe we're a large company and we're concerned with cash flow. Maybe we're a small company and we're concerned with cash flow. Maybe we're a medium-sized company and we're concerned with cash flow. Seeing any common threads there? So maybe before I sign my name and put this estimate together and propose this and sign some contract documents, maybe I want to understand what does this mean to my organization in terms of money in, money out. Am I going to be able to carry the freight on this job the first 3 months before I get a progress payment from the client? So I want to be able to look at that. Resource requirements over the course of time. Does it make sense for me to put my company at risk by proposing this job when I know I don't have enough heavy equipment operators already, and this is going to require me to maybe go out and hire some additional folks, or maybe change my strategy in terms of renting operated equipment versus staffing it myself. Maybe I'm interested in creating a time-phased budget, as we talked about earlier. So month 1, month 2, month 3, what are my expected expenditures? What are my expected revenues? And then maybe if this is important to me, maybe I need to secure some financing to be able to float this project, and maybe I want to calculate and include those finance costs in the estimate as well. So we'll take a look at all of these. As I joked about earlier, we've got different integrations with different scheduling tools. Let me jump into a project that's been set up to integrate with the scheduling tool I mentioned earlier, which was Primavera P6. So all of these activities that I've estimated, I can determine if I want to see those in the schedule or not, even at what level. Do I want to roll up to a certain level? Maybe there are sections of the estimate I don't want to include in the schedule. Maybe my indirect staff, or maybe some of my overhead costs, my bond costs, I don't want to see that showing up in the schedule as well. So what does this do for us? Well, it allows us to push this data to a schedule, and I'll go ahead and fire up the aforementioned tool right now, and we'll see what this project looks like once that schedule integration has been performed. So here's my estimate now sitting in the schedule. Initially, and I could have done this, but initially I pushed over all of the activities so that they shared the same start date, and then I did my logic ties, and I even created my level of effort activities out here in the scheduling tool. All right, and then by scheduling the project, what I've brought back into InEight Estimate has been these start, finish, early finish, late finish dates. And this can be very helpful to me as I'm now looking at what is my projected cost and revenue curve look like across the project. So I can see, okay, I'll be earning costs, I'll be earning revenue as we go through the project. Maybe I want to see this a little bit differently. Maybe instead of assuming that we're earning costs and earning revenue steadily as we're performing the work, maybe we've answered some questions, which I'll show in a second, that actually deal with money changing hands, i.e., when do we invoice the customer? How long does the invoice sit on the customer's desk before he or she pays it? What sort of retainage is being held? And in this case, I can see much more of a stair-step line based on those entries. So again, I can come over here to where my cash flow options are, and I can do things like answer questions about when do we bill. So you can stop laughing. We're not getting a 10-day turnaround. We're lucky if we get a 30-day turnaround. When are we submitting our invoices? Well, we're submitting invoices every month on the 25th. What sort of interest rate am I paying if I need to borrow money for this project? Again, you can stop laughing when I say how much interest are we earning when our revenues exceed our costs and we're doing nothing but sitting on a big pile of money. So let's say I'm borrowing at the rate of 5%, I'm earning at the rate of 0.25%. I can actually have that calculate finance costs for me as well. So very easy to determine. Here I've got an option that's chosen to calculate the finance cost automatically for me based on this graph. I could even see that cash flow curve and that finance cost in the graphic display as well. So very easy to see at what point we become cash flow positive on this project, the point at which this green line gets up and stays above that red line. Here I've got a nice visual representation of it if I wanted to dump this out into tabular format, like many of our customers do. We just can't get away from good old Microsoft Excel. Here's the data. It's broken down weekly. Each week telling me what my costs are going to be, what my price is going to be, and my cash flow position. So very easy to get the data out, be able to send it to somebody that's got an interest in that information that either doesn't have access to the tool or maybe they're outside of my organization. Very easy to take that raw data, dump it into a spreadsheet, slap a logo on it, maybe do some rough formatting and give them the data that they're interested in. You'll notice that not only can we look at costs across our project timeline, but maybe I'm interested in looking at some utilization of resources, maybe down to the specific general foreman and superintendent levels, and I want to be able to see what those look like in terms of costs and hours and requirements of those resources as well. So very easy to just come in here, apply some settings. When are we going to need that crane on the project? Does it make sense to leave it on the project for that duration of time? Does it make sense to demob it, get it off the project, not pay rent on it, and bring it back later? Does it make sense to look at the schedule and see if we can see if those activities where we're going to need the crane can be pushed together a little closer to avoid that sort of downtime? Those are the sorts of questions that our customers are able to answer by tying together their estimate with their schedule. Wouldn't be complete without a shameless plug. As many of you know, we've recently acquired a scheduling package called InEight Basis that we're very excited about integrating into this set of tools as well. So stay tuned for some more great information on that. Carolyn, I'm going to come up for air and take a sip of water. Looks like we're about 5 minutes.
Out. Yep. That was all 7. So thank you. We had a couple questions roll in, and one of them, I'll take the first question, Rick.
Please do.
So that one was about whether or not this session is recorded, and can we get a recording? So yes, we do record these each month, and they go on the website, InEight.com/webinars. So for those of you who are listening live, or for those of you who got this recording from your box to listen to, you'll find it there. So here's to you, Rick. These are your questions. If my company doesn't have a well-organized historic data, are there sources where I can buy some?
There are. Certainly, data providers like Richardson's come to mind. Those of you who do Gulf Coast Piping Works are familiar with the Page and Nations work. One of the things that we've heard, though, is that those are sort of more average sort of cost and price books. And one of the things that we've found is that our customers will typically have strengths and weaknesses. that don't necessarily align with those averages. So while those are all good sources of data, I would argue that the most important place to look for data would be within your organization. And like I mentioned earlier, and I know we had a little bit of fun with this, but when I mentioned, the best time to plant a tree is either 15 years ago or today, it might be a really good opportunity to start looking internally within your organization, because again, you might have strengths and weaknesses that would make your costs higher or lower than what those industry stated averages are. And I think if we're really serious about our business and we really want to exploit our strengths and work on our weaknesses, we need to learn how we compare with some of those standards. And when we're putting an estimate together, we need to understand how we can really lean on where our strengths are, and that might give us a competitive advantage than those industry averages might.
That's helpful. There's another question that came in, and you guys are welcome. We'll see. I don't know. There's 2 minutes left, so I'd love to encourage you to send in more, but I'm not sure we'll get to them. So someone asked, they said you showed an integration with P6 at the end. Did your estimating system integrate with other schedules too?
Yeah, absolutely. So out of the box, it integrates with P6. It integrates with Microsoft Project. As I mentioned earlier, we've got great plans to integrate this with our own scheduling tool on an InEight basis. And then for those customers who just want to be able to see sort of the time phase slicing of their costs and their resources, you can just simply type in start and finish dates as well. You don't necessarily need to run this through a schedule and create those, those relationships, predecessors and successors and logic links. You can just say this activity is going to start on June 1st, this activity is going to start on June 15th, this activity is going to start on August 30th, and still be able to generate those histograms and those cache curves as well. Great question.
Thank you for answering at lightning speed. I'll cram in one more. I want to get through all the audience questions. So, succinctly, Rick, in your experience, how would we go about loading all of our historic data so that we can begin the benchmark? Maybe I should ask that one first.
Yeah, no, great question. And I'd say great question. I would challenge the word all. All of our data, again, that's going to get us looking over our shoulder at the past rather than focusing on the future. Maybe what we can do is go through that historic data and find some really good candidate projects to input. Very easy to do. We do this all the time. We can get the data uploaded. We can suck it in through Excel. I would argue that the key criteria would be to make sure it's properly labeled, coded, described, and then the import process really doesn't take that much time at all. I'd say that the focus should be really on gathering the right data and organizing it in such a way, and then putting some business practices and some policies in place where going forward we can continue to use those organizational standards to continue to label and codify things in a consistent manner, knowing that, okay, maybe this is a little bit of investment in time. Maybe on day one, I'm not going to get all of my historic data in, which is just a best practice recommendation. We can certainly load it all in, but a lot of times that just results in a lot of disorganized data. I'd say let's really focus on organizing some data, bring it into the tool, and then going forward, let's put a plan together to make sure everything from this point moving forward is properly organized, and then what we can do is 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months from now, really start enjoying some good historic data.
It's probably actually a topic we should look at for its own webinar. So thank you for those of you who tuned in the live presentation. We do this once a month, and Rick happens to be our presenter again next month. So the whole idea is to bring you these skill building, another feather to put in your cap sort of presentations to help you and your team be more efficient at estimating. So if it was Rick's tricks this time, it is probably Rick's cliff notes next time. So he's giving his expert advice on bid review preparation techniques. So we did the bidding work today, and we'll do the bid review prep next time. So join us on May 15th. It's again during this lunch hour. And again, you got it forward to you from your boss to listen to. you better walk away with one or two golden nuggets. So, Rick, thank you very much for your time. It's been very entertaining, and we'll see you again in May.
The pleasure has been mine entirely. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.